they're drug abusers, okay, they're alcohol abusers. Well, I think everybody would be outraged by something like that. You know, even a private contract that says, well, as part of working for your firm, you the employer, can come in and randomly search my house. I don't think anybody would agree to that. And yet now we're saying people, oh, well, you can randomly search my bodily fluids. I really think that this is incredible, and I think it will be seen as really as obnoxious and dirty as it is in the future. As for its efficacy, there are certain workplaces where there have been legitimate illicit drug abuse problems, and drug testing can, in the short run, have some effect there. Like if there's a lot of people doing dope, yeah, it'll get those people on fairly short order. In longer term, what happens is the people go over to alcohol or other less detectable drugs like LSD. In the Navy, I don't know if you've heard about this, but they started a lot of drug testing in the Navy, and then so everybody stopped smoking dope and they started doing LSD. And this never shows up on the drug tests because, you know, actually the Navy has just tried to develop a test for LSD, but it's not going to be very, very workable in any case. It's not a very sensitive test. So in addition, you're going to see the development of new drugs out there, which will be less sensitive to drug tests, including, by the way, synthetic analogs of marijuana, which will not reside in the body as long, which will wash out like alcohol, and which will probably be considerably more toxic, have a higher risk of overdose. But these drugs already exist, they're on the drawing boards, and it's only a matter of time before things like this get produced. So I don't think it's a very viable strategy in the long term. And I think in almost all cases where drug abuse is a problem in the workplace, management, it's the kind of thing that good management should be able to detect. I mean, you can tell when workers are stoned on the job, and the workers know when they're stoned on the job. And if they're not telling the management, it's because there's bad relations between the management and the workers in the first place. But you take the classic case is the Conrail accident where the engineer and the brakeman had smoked some marijuana shortly before this accident that killed 16 people. And, you know, there's a fairly close, they were definitely under the influence of marijuana at the time, even though they claimed that the marijuana didn't really affect their performance. It's hard to credit that. But in any case, these people, this crew, had a long record of alcohol abuse problems that were known to the company. I mean, I believe it was the engineer had gotten a call once saying to come in, and he said, well, gee, I'm sorry, I can't, I'm drunk at the moment. And they said, well, sorry, you got to come in anyway. That was on the record. Each of them had a record of drunken driving violations, all right? All of this was there. The National Transportation Safety Board reviewed the accident, and they made a long list of recommendations, which really came into two categories. First, that there ought to be management changes, and secondly, that there were equipment problems, that there were very, very basic safety devices which would have completely avoided this accident were missing, devices that are widely used in Europe and everywhere else. Nowhere did the National Transportation Safety Board mention drug testing. They didn't think it was that relevant. It was the higher-ups, it was the Department of the Secretary of Transportation who inserted that and said, all right, now we got to have drug testing. You see, we had this accident. But the actual, you know, so that's the kind of hysteria we've worked ourselves into on that. Okay.
I think the NORML was that criminalization is actually a real one.
Well, okay, but there is
That's always been the way the press is. Every issue that comes along. Every issue, that's the way the press works. And just don't want to work. It doesn't work the way you could bring us sensationalizing pieces or rubble. I mean, that'll come sometime down the line. Yeah, I did. Yeah, I mean, I have it on good authority that some of the movie stories use cocaine. I mean,
Why don't we take it outside? Yeah, we'll take it outside.
See you guys later.
Excuse me, we're going to start the gun rights plank in about 1 minute. Okay, we're on a tight schedule, so I'm going to go ahead and start, knowing that it's libertarian style to come into the door after the speaker starts. Anyway, the gun issue is very big amongst libertarians, and one of them said that he'd love to introduce our speaker, and where he is, I don't know. So I'm the replacement. And if there's one thing I hate is introductions that are read. But I don't have a choice, so please bear with me, and this is what I have. John Hosford is the Executive Director of the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, not the Second Amendment Committee that I mistakenly put in the flyer, and I apologize for that. He is a Marine Corps veteran and a retired detective from the King County Police in Seattle, Washington. John is one of the few police officers in America to have received the J. Edgar Hoover Memorial Gold Medal from the American Police Hall of Fame upon recommendation of the National Association of Chiefs of Police and the American Federation of Police. John has been involved in the gun rights movement since 1964, when Senator Tom Dodd began his assault on the importation of military rifles. John heads up the day-to-day operations of the Citizens Committee, which has over 650,000 members nationwide, including over 160 members of Congress. As a side note, John has a distinction of being the police John has the distinction of being the police sniper called to SeaTac Airport in Seattle on Thanksgiving Eve 1971 when D.B. Cooper perpetrated the first skyjacking in U.S. history. So, John, are you ready? I'll give you John. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. So much for enthusiasm. Good afternoon. How are you? I'm thinking the first thing I'm going to do here in California is I'm going to cut everybody's pay. I left a blizzard in Seattle. There's 6 inches of snow on the ground when I called home this afternoon, talked to my 2 sons, and I told them I came to sunny California to lay by the poolside in my free time and to try to enjoy a little bit of the sun and fun that California has. I spent 2 days in our office in Sacramento and driving rainstorms and snow, and I got down here and it's cold, it's gray. What the hell did you guys do with the sun, you know? Hey, and by the way, in Seattle, it does rain a lot, but as you can see, I'm not rusty. You know, we do have something up there other than rust on us. When they asked me to come down and make a presentation to you on the history of the Second Amendment, I told them I'd be more than happy to do it. I've done this many times traveling around the country, and it takes 4 hours. I have a regular class that I give that is 4 hours long. They told me that I'd only have an hour, and so I then commenced to put my staff to work and a few other things, and we have condensed a 4-hour class down to a little less than an hour, and hopefully we can get through this and leave you still some time for questions and answers. Before I get started into it, though, I want to go and make a couple of explanations, because I get this everywhere we go, is people will want to know what is the difference between the NRA, the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, and the Second Amendment Foundation. So to start with, I'll start with the NRA. I am a life member of the NRA, and as a member of the NRA, I join a core of 2.8 million NRA members across the nation. The NRA is an organization made up of gun owners that is established for the betterment of the shooting sports, for firearm safety, for police training, for civilian training in civilian marksmanship. The NRA Institute for Legislative Action. Now, there's a big distinction between NRA and NRA-ILA. The NRA-ILA, which is headed up by Wayne LaPierre, a very good friend of mine, is the political arm of the NRA. Now, the Citizens Committee is like the NRA-ILA. We have the distinction of being older than they are, and actually the NRA-ILA is patterned after the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms. In 1971, the Citizens Committee was formed by 11 life members of the National Rifle Association when, at that time, following the passage of the infamous Gun Control Act of 1968, the NRA did not get involved and did not want to become involved in the issue of politics and guns. 4 years later, by which time the Citizens Committee had grown to about 80,000 members and was raising about $300,000 to $350,000 a year, the NRA then became involved in the political conflict. In 1976, the Board of Directors authorized the chairman of the board of the Citizens Committee to form a 501c3 legal defense fund and public education foundation, which became known as the Second Amendment Foundation. The Second Amendment Foundation does not involve itself in politics at all. The Second Amendment Foundation, for example, was the organization that put up the money for the defense of Bernard Goetz, the so-called subway vigilante in New York City. The Second Amendment Foundation, the legal defense arm, was the group that hired Don Cates, and we subsequently then overturned the handgun ban in San Francisco and sent Dianne Feinstein back, 30 paces. Norwich, Connecticut, we again turned over the handgun ban there. The Citizens Committee itself is strictly a gun lobby, but we are, by charter, responsible for the effective mobilization of the grassroots gun lobby in America. I don't come in and take over the show like an organization that is involved in direct lobbying does. I don't vote here in California. I don't live here in California. And even though I have a ton of money to spend here in California, politicians don't want to hear specifically from me. They want to hear from you, the electorate. So my job is to come to California when there's an issue, to come in and provide you with the resources, the logistics, the materials necessary to carry on your job to defend your constitutional rights. And that's how the Citizens Committee is distinctly different from the NRA. Now, does anybody have any questions about that before we get going? And I'll have time, hopefully, at the end of this presentation for Q&A when we get done. What I'm going to do is we got 45 minutes left in our time. I'm going to put this down at my timer in at 30 minutes, and we'll see how far we get. I'm going to ask your indulgence because of the fact that to try to cover such an important subject as the issue of the history of the Second Amendment, it required that an awful lot of data be condensed down rather than where I can take the mic and freely walk through the room and talk to people and get your input. And so an awful lot of this, you're going to see me looking down at my notes rather than looking out to you, because this is the first time I've made a presentation in such a condensed portion. So with that, I'll get a drink of water and ready, and we'll get into this. The right to keep and bear arms as a part of English and American law antecedes not only the Constitution, but also the discovery of firearms. Under the laws of Alfred the Great, whose reign began in 872 AD, all English citizens, from the nobility to the peasants, were obliged to privately purchase weapons and be available for military duty. Now, this is in sharp contrast to the feudal system as it evolved in Europe, under which armament and military duties were concentrated in the nobility. The body of armed citizens were known as the freed, and surprisingly enough, that was spelled F-Y-R-D. While a great many of the Saxon rights were abridged following the Norman conquest, the right and duty of arms possession was retained. Under the Assize of Arms in 1181, the whole community of free men between the ages of 15 and 40 were required by law to possess certain arms, which were arranged in proportion to their possessions. They were required twice a year to demonstrate to royal officials that they were appropriately armed. In 1253, another Assize of Arms expanded the duty of armament to include not only free men, but also the villeins, which were the equivalent of English serfs. Now, all citizens, burgesses, free tenants, villeins, and others from the age of 15 to 60 were obliged to be armed. While on the continent, the villeins were regarded as little more than animals hungering for rebellion, the English legal system not only permitted, but actively required them to be armed. The 13th century saw further definition of this right as the longbow, and at that time it was a very formidable armor-piercing weapon, became increasingly the mainstay of British national policy. In 1285, Edward I commanded that all persons comply with the earlier Assize of Arms and added that, and I quote, anyone else who can afford them should keep bows and arrows. The right of armament was subject only to narrow limitations. In 1279, it was ordered that those appearing in Parliament or other public assemblies, and I quote, shall come without all force and armor well and peaceably. In other words, come, feel free, but leave your guns at the door. In 1328, the Statute of Northampton ordered that no one use their arms in a fray of the peace, nor to go nor ride armed by day or night in fairs, markets, nor in the presence of the justices or the ministers. Now, not to be taken as a ban, the English courts construed this ban, as they call it, consistently with the general right of private armament as applying only to the wearing of arms, accompanying with such circumstances are apt to terrify the people. In other words, what they were talking about was outright brandishment of firearms or weapons or anything that's, you're just jousting about trying to go and raise hell in the community. And this is what they were saying, is that, we're not going to go for this. In 1369, the king ordered that the sheriffs of London require all citizens at leisure time and on holidays to use in their recreation bows and arrows and to stop all other games which might distract them from this practice. Now, this was his method of maintaining consistency and efficiency with the weapons of the day. The Tudor kings experimenting with limits upon specialized weapons, mainly crossbows, and then the new firearms. These measures were not intended to disarm the citizenry, but on the contrary, to prevent their being diverted from longbow practice by sport or other weapons which were considered less effective. Now, most of us know that the crossbow was really a very effective weapon, for accuracy. But in those days, the kings and the monarchs decided that, in fact, the longbow was still the weapon of the day. They were more comfortable with it, and they didn't want everybody running around with these newfound firearms and these crossbows and making use of them to the detriment, in their opinion, of their efficiency with the longbow. Even these narrow measures were short-lived. In 1503, Henry VII limited shooting, but not the possession of crossbows, to those who had land worth 200 marks in rental value, but he provided an exception. You could be poor, and you could have one of these firearms if you could shoot off of a horse for the lawful defense of the same, i.e., if you can defend the king by, while on horseback, shooting one of these, then you could have one. But if you couldn't, you had to have 200 marks annual rental and property. He also expanded the requirement of longbow ownership, requiring all citizens to use and exercise shooting of the longbows and to have bows and arrows continually in the home. In addition, fathers were required by the king to purchase bows and arrows for their sons by the time that they were 7 years old and to actively train them from the ages of 7 to 14 years of age in longbow use. In 1514, the ban on crossbows was extended to include firearms. But in 1533, King Henry reduced the property qualification to 100 pounds per year, and then again in 1541, he limited its possession to small firearms. Those of the length of 1 whole yard for some firearms and 3/4 of a yard for other firearms. Again, talking in length, I could never understand in my research, I could never understand what difference the length made, but this was something that they felt was the thing, that we're going to go and restrict your access. We want to keep you capable on the longbow. The later Tudor monarchs continued the system, and Elizabeth added to it by creating what came to be known as train bands, which were selected portions of the citizenry chosen for special training. These train bands were distinguished from the militia, which term was first used during the era of the Spanish Armada crisis to designate the entire armed citizenry. The militia continued to be a pivotal force in the English political system. The British historian, Charles Oman, considered the existence of an armed citizenry to be a major reason for the modernization of monarchical rule in Great Britain. Quoting, "More than once he," meaning Henry VIII, "had to restrain himself when he discovered that the general feelings of his subjects was against him. His gentlemen pensioners and his yeomen of the guard were but a handful, and the bills or bows were in every farm and cottage." So going clear back to then, we can see that government had a concern about an armed population. When Civil War broke out in 1642, the critical issue was whether the king or parliament had the right to control the militia. The aftermath of the Civil War saw England in temporary control of a military government, which repeatedly dissolved Parliament and authorized its officers to search for and seize all arms owned by Catholics, opponents of the government, or any other person whom the commissioners had judged dangerous to the peace and welfare of the Commonwealth. The military government ended with the restoration of Charles II. Charles, in turn, opened his reign with a variety of repressive legislation, expanding the definition of treason, establishing press censorship, and ordering his supporters to form their own troops, telling them, the officers to be numerous, disaffected persons watched and not allowed to assemble, and their arms seized. In 1662, the Militia Act was enacted, empowering officials to search for and seize all arms in custody or possession of any person or persons whom said lieutenants or any two of their deputies judge dangerous to the peace of the kingdom. Now we're getting into weapon control. Gunsmiths were ordered to deliver to the government lists of all purchasers. These confiscations were continued under James II, who directed them particularly against the Irish population. Although the country was infested with predatory bands, a Protestant gentleman could scarcely obtain permission to keep a brace of pistols. In 1668, the government of James was overturned in a peaceful uprising, which became known as the Glorious Revolution. Parliament resolved that James had abdicated and promulgated a Declaration of Rights, later enacted as the Bill of Rights. Before coronation, his successor, William of Orange, was required to swear to respect these rights. What had happened is that the governing body had said, before we allow you to rule us, you're going to swear that you're going to go and uphold these Bill of Rights that we have established. The debates in the House of Commons over this Declaration of Rights focused largely upon the disarmament under the 1662 Militia Act. One member complained that, quoting, an act of Parliament was made to disarm all Englishmen, who the lieutenant should suspect by day or night, by force or otherwise. This was done in Ireland for the sake of putting arms in Irish hands. The speech of another was summarized as, quoting, Militia Bill. Power to disarm all England, now done in Ireland. A third member of Parliament complained, arbitrary power exercised by the ministry, militia, imprisoning without cause, disarming, himself disarmed. The Bill of Rights, as drafted by the House of Commons, simply provided that acts concerning the militia were grievous to the subject and that it is necessary for the public safety that the subjects, which are Protestants, shall provide and keep arms for the common defense, and that the arms which have been seized and taken from them be restored. Now, the House of Lords changed this to make it a more positive declaration of an individual right under English law. Quoting again, that the subjects which are Protestant may have arms for their defense suitable to their conditions and as allowed by law. The only limitation was on ownership by Catholics, who at that time composed only a few percent of the British population and were subject to a wide variety of punitive legislation. The Parliament subsequently made clear what it meant by the term suitable to their conditions and allowed by law. The poorer citizens had been restricted from owning firearms as well as traps and other commodities useful for hunting by the 1671 Game Act. Following the Bill of Rights, Parliament reenacted that statute, leaving its operative parts unchanged with one exception, that being the removal of the word guns from the list of items forbidden to the poorer citizens. The right to keep and bear arms would henceforth belong to all English subjects, rich or poor, regardless of your standard. Now in the colonies, those of us over here on the mainland already, availability of hunting and the need for defense led to armament statutes comparable to those in the early Saxon times. In 1623, Virginia forbade its colonists from traveling unless they were well armed. In 1631, it required colonists to engage in target practice on Sundays and to bring their pieces to church. In 1658, it required each householder to have a functioning firearm within his house, and in 1673, its laws provided that a citizen who claimed he was too poor to purchase a firearm would have one purchased for him by the government, which then in turn would require that when he could afford to pay it back, he would pay for his gun. And you see that today here in America? In Massachusetts, the first session of the legislature ordered that not only free men, but also indentured servants own firearms. Kind of contrary to what we saw after the Civil War. And in 1644, it imposed a stern 6-shilling fine upon any citizen who was not armed. Boy, they roll over in their graves every time I tell them that at HCI. That's Handgun Control Incorporated, for those of you that don't know about HCI. When the British government began to increase its military presence in the colonies in the mid-18th century, Massachusetts responded by calling upon its citizens to arm themselves. One colony newspaper argued that it was impossible to complain that his act was illegal since they were British subjects to whom the privilege of possessing arms was expressly recognized by the Bill of Rights, while another argued that it is a natural right which the people have reserved for themselves, confirmed by the Bill of Rights, to keep arms for their own defense. The newspaper cited Blackstone's commentaries of the laws of England, which had listed the having and using guns for self-preservation and defense among the absolute rights of individuals. Now, we're going clear back now to English law. Again, remember, we're talking the absolute right of individuals. You know, and Blackstone's law is still used today. You go to any office of the United States Supreme Court Justice and you'll find Blackstone's law on the bookshelf. The colonists felt that they had an absolute right, as well as the common law then, to own firearms. Together with freedom of the press, the right to keep and bear arms became one of the individual rights most prized by the colonists. When British troops seized a militia arsenal in September of 1774, and incorrect rumors that colonists had been killed spread through Massachusetts, 60,000 citizens took up arms. A few months later, when Patrick Henry delivered his famed "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, he spoke in support of a proposition that a well-regulated militia composed of gentlemen and freemen is the natural strength and only security of a free government. Throughout the following revolution, formal and informal units of armed citizens obstructed British communication, cut off foraging parties, and harassed the thinly stretched regular forces. When 7 states adopted states' Bill of Rights following the Declaration of Independence, each of those Bill of Rights provided either for protection of the concept of a militia or for the expressed right to keep and bear arms. Now, what we just talked about here was the revolution, the start of the revolution. You know, I think that it's really unique when we look back into American history, to our history, that we were willing to stand out there and let the British come in and tax the heck out of us. The Boston Tea Party, we showed our disdain for what they wanted. How did we do it? We threw a bunch of tea into the bay. You know, taxation, we lived with it, we accepted it, and we complained. But we did no more. When we did something wrong, the British incarcerated us, threw us on a ship, and sent us back to England. No trial by jury of our peers, which were guaranteed to American citizens. You know, no representation, nothing. We lived with it, we took it. But the day they came to take our guns, April 19th, 1775, a major by the name of Pitcairn came down the Concord Road, and he met 75 good men headed up by a captain by the name of John Parker, the head of the militiamen at Lexington. Pitcairn met those Minutemen on the green, and the shot that was heard round the world started the fight that gave us our true and deserved independence. Now, why was Pitcairn there? He was there to go to Concord to take the guns. It took that to get this country, to get the people in this country off their rear ends, to stand up and to fight for what was rightfully theirs. People say that our country was founded because of oppression. No, our country was founded because the people were not going to give up their right to self-defense, their right to go and protect themselves, their homes, their family, and the country that they had come to love. Following the revolution, but previous to the adoption of the Constitution, debates over militia proposals occupied a large part of the political scene. A variety of plans were put forth by figures ranging from George Washington to Baron von Steuben. All of the proposals called for a general duty of all citizens to be armed, although some proposals, most notably von Steuben's, also emphasized a select militia, which would be paid for its services and given special training. I'm going to stop here again. The importance of this right here. Most people can't see the importance, but here, in the debates of the Continental Congress, a clear distinction was made, that the right to keep and bear arms was an individual right and not a collective right, which the anti-gunners, the anti-gun politicians continually insist that the collective right is guaranteed when it says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Wrong. That's the language, but von Steuben makes the clear distinction here. And in the debates of the Continental Congress, they face this issue over and over and over again and make a clear distinction between the militia, which is the body of the whole, and the select militia. This is very important because as you go along, people will talk about, well, this is just a collective right. And if you ever get into any debates with anybody from Handgun Control Incorporated or any of these here politicians that think they know what the heck they're talking about, you come back and you hit them and you go back to von Steuben's original remarks. The select militia. That was the militia that was for the common defense. But the militia by itself was the people, you and I, and that's what gives us our right under the Second Amendment. In this respect, the select militia was the successor of the trained bands and the predecessor of what is today's National Guard. In the debates over the Constitution, Von's proposals were criticized as undemocratic. In Connecticut, one writer complained of a proposal that this looks too much like a Baron von Steuben's militia, which is a standing army and was meant to be a standing army and intended. Again, we must remember that during the early debates over our Constitution, the standing army was something that was greatly feared because of what they had experienced from the British. Richard Henry Lee, in his widely read pamphlet, Letters from the Federal Farmer to the Republican, worried that the people might be disarmed by modeling a militia. Should 1/5 or 1/8 part of the people capable of bearing arms be made into a select militia? Again, he used that word. As has been proposed, and those the young and ardent parts of the community possessed with little or no property, the former will answer all the purposes of an army, while the latter will be defenseless. Now, what did he say there in his commentary? What he said was that some guy with money could come in and provide funds to those that were young and strong who didn't have money, who had no job, and he could hire them to be his own personal, private standing army. And this was something that they weren't going to have any part of. He proposed that the Constitution ought to secure a genuine and guard against a select militia, adding that, and I quote, "To preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of the people always possess arms and be taught alike, especially when young, how to use them." The suspicion of select militia units expressed in these passages is a clear indication that the framers of the Constitution did not seek to guarantee a state right to maintain formed groups similar to the National Guard, but rather to protect the right of individual citizens to keep and bear arms. Lee, in particular, sat in the Senate which approved those Bill of Rights, and he would hardly have meant that the Second Amendment was to apply only to the select militias, the ones that he so feared and despised. Other figures of the period were of like mind. In Virginia, during their convention, George Mason, drafter of the Virginia Bill of Rights, accused the British of having plotted to disarm the people. That was the best and most effective way to enslave them. While Patrick Henry observed that the great object is that every man be armed, and everyone who is able may have a gun. Nor were the anti-federalists, to whom we owe credit for the Bill of Rights, alone on this account. Federalist arguments also provide a source of support for an individual right view. Their arguments in favor of the proposed Constitution also relied heavily upon universal armament. The proposed Constitution had been heavily criticized for its failure to ban or even limit standing armies. Unable to deny this omission, the Constitution's supporters frequently argued to the people that the universal armament of Americans made such limitations necessary. Now, a pamphlet written by Noah Webster aimed at swaying Pennsylvania towards ratification, urged this, and I'm going to quote from it. Before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed. As they are in almost every kingdom of Europe, the supreme power in America cannot enforce unjust laws by the sword because the whole body of the people are armed and constitute a superior force to any band of regular troops that can be, on any pretense, raised in these United States. In the Massachusetts Convention, Sedgwick echoed the same thought, rhetorically asking if an oppressive army could be formed or, if raised, whether they could subdue a nation of free men who know how to prize liberty and who have arms in hand. In the Federalist Papers, number 46, James Madison, who I'm sure most of you know later authored the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, mentioned the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over people of the other countries, and that notwithstanding the military establishments of the several kingdoms of Europe, which are carried as far as the public resources will bear, the governments are afraid to trust the people with arms. Even back then, they saw. Madison had the ability to see what we see today. A third and even more compelling case for the individual rights perspective of the Second Amendment come from the state's demands for a Bill of Rights. You recall that we passed the Constitution, and then we had to turn around and come back 2 years later with the Bill of Rights. We had to do this because that was the agreement among the states. They weren't going to sign the Constitution. They would not ratify it without those guarantees. The first such call came from a group of Pennsylvanian delegates. Their proposals, which were not adopted but had a crucial effect on future debates, proposed, among other rights, that, and I quote again, the people have the right to bear arms for defense of themselves and their own state, or the United States, for the purpose of killing game, and no law shall be passed to disarm the people or any of them unless for crimes committed or a real danger to public injury from individuals. In Massachusetts, Sam Adams unsuccessfully pushed for a ratification conditioned on the adoption of a Bill of Rights beginning with a guarantee, and I quote again, that the said Constitution shall never be construed to authorize Congress to infringe the just liberty of the press or of the right of conscience, or to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms. When New Hampshire gave the Constitution the 9th vote needed for its passage into effect, it called it for adoption of a Bill of Rights, which included the provision that Congress shall never disarm any citizen unless such as are or have been in actual rebellion. Virginia and North Carolina thereafter called for a provision, quoting again, that the people have the right to keep and bear arms, that a well-regulated militia comprised of the body of the people trained to arms is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. When the first Congress convened for the purpose of drafting a Bill of Rights, it delegated the task to James Madison. Madison did not write upon a blank tablet. Instead, he obtained a pamphlet listing the state's proposals for a Bill of Rights and sought to produce a briefer version, incorporating all of the vital proposals that the other states had submitted. His purpose was to incorporate, not to distinguish by technical change, proposals such as that of the Pennsylvania minority. And the New Hampshire delegates, Sam Adams, Madison, they proposed along with other rights that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, A well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country, but no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. That was the original text that Madison came up for the Bill of Rights. In the House, this was initially modified so that the militia clause came before the proposed recognition of the right. The proposals of the Bill of Rights were then